Hey drifters, are you ready to produce? On today's episode of Catch Your Drift, we will be continuing our mini-series around the subject of dynamics. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about compression. Compression is one of the most common topics in mixing. And I think that it's good to do a visual representation of this because this is a subject that I think it's a bit hard to explain at times. We're going to do my best with some drawings. I think that should hopefully help make it more clear. Compression is essentially about, again, just reducing dynamic range. Now, you can do that in very heavy ways. For instance, if you're doing parallel compression, you can do it in softer ways. You can do it in what they call series, where you're stacking compressors. You're compressing a little bit with this, compressing a little bit with the second one. That also relates back to what we were talking about doing these things in stages. It's a very common way of doing things in the audio industry, and it ultimately gives the sounds a much more pleasant sound than when you're going very, very aggressive. At least for your main sound that you're going for. So with compression, basically what you're doing is you're going to kind of squeeze down that waveform a little bit. The thing that's important about this is that there are, depending on the types of compressors you use, things called attack and release time. And that will ultimately change the way the compressor works to kind of squeeze down that information. So let's take a look at the board real quick. Let's say that this is a vocal, and we want to ultimately squeeze this down. A little bit like that. So first off, there's a whole bunch of different ranges of the ways you can set compressors. Very typical ones, for instance, is like a 2-to-1 or a 4-to-1. Typically, it can go all the way up to 10-to-1 before it starts getting into technically what they call limiting. But basically, you're just going to be pushing that down. The more range that you reduce, for instance, 4-to-1 is going to reduce the range more than 2-to-1. Basically, it just involves pushing that range down further than you would at a softer rate. So as you're doing that, there's something called a threshold, for instance. Let's say that you set the threshold there. Basically, everything that goes over that line, it's going to start to compress. Pretty easy to understand so far. Where things can get a little bit confusing is when it comes to transients. Transients are basically that initial peak of the sound that comes through. Realistically, it looks something more like this. Even smaller than that, actually almost like a straight line. But I'm basically going to enlarge that transient, we'll call it this, and that'll help me kind of describe the differences between attack and release. So basically when you're working with attack and release times, that's talking about how quickly the compressor is going to get to its maximum compression for attack and quickest release for release. So basically, if you have a very, very quick attack time, let's say that when it's here, that's when it's going to reach its peak compression level. If, on the other hand, you have a slower attack time, it could be that it reaches its peak compression time a little bit later in that transient. And again, why that's important is that that will ultimately change the way that transient sounds in the mix, because it will do something like this. It will take, in the example of a very, very quick attack time, it'll make the new waveform look something like this. So it's just going to let through a little bit of that transient through, and then it will quickly compress the rest of it. If, on the other hand, you have a slower attack time, it will do something like this. It's a bit exaggerated, but I think you get the idea of what's going on. It's basically moving where is that transient being compressed and how quickly and how fast. Now, as it relates to release time, it's kind of working in conjunction with that attack time, but basically it's kind of just doing it on the back end. So for example, a quick release time, maybe the compressor starts to release around there. And again, a slower release time, maybe the compressor starts to release around there. So basically these two controls, the attack and the release time, they are working in conjunction with each other, and they're giving you a lot of control over the way you're going to shape your transients. They ultimately give you a lot of tone shaping capabilities, and that's very important when you're doing that over the course of your whole mix. Now, I will say that in my opinion, compression is not ultimately the best way to control dynamics in terms of your very peak reduction. If you actually look at what a lot of compressors do, a lot of times, even if you turn your attack time up as quick as possible, they're still going to let some of that initial transient through that can ultimately be problematic when it comes time to start reducing range across the whole mix. Because what you'll wind up getting is a lot of those peaks coming through, and that's going to make it harder when you get to the mastering stage to crank it up without kind of hurting the mix at that point and getting more distortion. The other topics that we're talking about in this course related to, for example, limiting, hard clipping, saturating, overall soft clipping, even maximizing. I think some of those things can ultimately give you a better way to kind of control those peak dynamics. But compression is still a tool for sure. And it's a very, very important tool for tone shaping purposes. So I think that's something very important to keep in mind, fellow riders. Okay, riders, I think that's a great place to stop for today as it pertains to compression. Compression is a very complex topic. There's probably a lot more I can say about it. Of course, if you have any questions at all, please just leave me a comment and I'd be more than happy to get back to you. We can talk about it. If you're having any specific troubles, we can work on them together. Absolutely no problem. In the next episode in this series, we're going to be talking about maximizers, limiting, and hard clipping. See you soon, riders.